who will be talking about neuron doctrines. So at noon, it's on the neuron doctrine from noon to 1:30. And on Friday, Kate Female, another center fellow, will also be giving a talk here at the center at noon on mechanism and machine metaphors. No, it's not next week. Actually. Next week. I got confused. Next Friday. I know I scared you. First, the testing is that you're paying attention, and second, just to scare you a little bit. So I think I did. It was a success in both respects. In any case, next Friday we do not have a lunchtime talk. Correction. We do have our third lecture in the annual lecture series, which will be given by John Fuller at 3:30 p.m. on the 10th floor, and the topic of John's lecture is what's in a diagnosis towards the philosophy of diagnostic medicine. Thanks. Okay. I know that when I was looking at your face, I'd be saying something wrong. So, all right, very good. Today it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Joe McCaffrey, who nearly all of you, I suppose, know. It's sort of a welcome back. It's been a welcome back for the whole semester. In part because Joe got his PhD here at Pitt, in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science, and I had the privilege and the honor and the pleasure and so on and so forth to be Joe's advisor. And you know, it's always an immense pleasure when you see your former PhD student thrive and come back and be faculty in their own right. I think it's actually one of those things that are just incredible. You know. Being an advisor is time-consuming. It's not always. No, Joe was an exception, of course. It's not always a sailing on a smooth ocean. Joe was an exception. Yeah. But the reward of seeing your former students become faculty and thrive is just incredible. So. Thanks, actually. So Joe is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. He's also part of the neuroscience program, and he's also part of the medical humanities faculty. He works in the philosophy of neuroscience, philosophy of cognitive science, and philosophy of mind. He has published on topics such as functional localization. In fact, part of his dissertation was on that topic as well. And we're going to be hearing some of his more recent thoughts on the topic. He has written on mental kinds as well, and he's finishing an elements on concepts in cognitive science and neuroscience. So he has published on all these topics in the best journals, and he's finishing a book on one of these topics, and maybe there will be a book in the future on functional localization. Joe, floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Edouard, for that truly kind introduction. It's wonderful to be back here, not just with Edouard, who actually probably was patient with me, as I was more of a handful than he alluded to, but also in the HPS community among so many friendly faces and in a place that values history and philosophy of science. I did think about a note I wanted to give at the outset of the talk for the graduate students, who may be joining, which is to say that the history that you learn matters and is going to inform the philosophy that you do, that there will always be opportunities for Thomas Kuhn to pop up everywhere, and that you may find communities of scientists who are interested in engaging with philosophy. Okay, so I'm here today to talk about functional localization in Flux. Functional localization is considered a central paradigm or framework, call it what you'd like, or for cognitive neuroscience, right? We can think of functional localization as a mapping project trying to specify the functions of structures of the brain and to say clearly what it is that they do. I am primarily working in the framework of human cognitive neuroscience, much of the experiments draw on fMRI, but I take it that these issues broaden, and we'll see some of that broadening. So cognitive neuroscience has, as we'll see, unending debates between proponents of localization and opponents or anti-localizationists. And these debates are heating up in the here and now. However, what it means to affirm or deny localization in cognitive neuroscience is rarely explicit, and therefore the debates are quite messy. There's lots of talking past each other, lots of shifting the goalposts. So one thing as philosophers we need to do is get clear on what this debate is about. And here on the slide, I just wanted to mention much of my talk about the brain is really about the human cerebral cortex, the gray enfolded 2 millimeter thick surface of the brain. One of the things that really animates the question of functional localization is that the cortex is, in some sense, this mass, right? But we think that there are possibly functional units buried within that mass. Okay. So today's talk is drawing from work that I've published in 2023, and then trying to show where I think the project is going, right? So what I'm going to talk about today, debates about functional localization are live here and now in contemporary neuroscience. This isn't just a kind of vagary of 19th century neuroscience. And I'll give a conceptual analysis of functional localization. I think one of the things philosophy of science does is analyze concepts. Functional localization we may think of as a paradigm, but also as a concept. What is it for functions to localize? I'm going to argue that localization consists of 3 tenets: structural specialization, localization of function, and intrinsicality. And I'll say a lot about what those are. Anti-localization in contemporary neuroscience is going to be, in modest forms, maybe the denial of one of these tenets, and in more extreme forms, the denial of all of them in some kind of systematic way. And I'm going to show how we can use this framework to understand what current debates about localization are about. And then I'm going to present some work in progress that is sort of geared toward, okay, now that we've sort of established the problem, are neuroscientists making progress on it? What are the questions we need to look into? And there today, I'm actually going to focus on the issue of bias in cognitive neuroscience. Some of my recent work has kind of, made it salient to me that neuroscientists are kind of accusing each other of not being able to get fair answers to this question due to bias. So that's where I'll go. As I said, that's work in progress. So first, I'm going to introduce historically the debate between localizationists and anti-localizationists. This isn't a complete history. It's kind of moments or vignettes. But to give you a sense of what the localization debate has been about and what it looks like today. I'm then going to give my conceptual analysis, which seeks to establish the dimensions of localization. And then I'm going to move to this idea that localization maybe right now is kind of a paradigm in crisis, and that we need to figure out sort of where we are in this conceptual space that I outline in part 2 of the talk. And in section 4, I'm going to kind of introduce this idea that maybe one of the reasons we can't sort of agree about these issues, even when looking at the same data, is because scientific bias is kind of entering into these debates. So there's a lot. It's messy, as we'll see. Okay. All right. So the localization debates don't start in the 19th century, but we often kind of locate the kind of fundamental distinction between localizationism and anti-localizationism there in the 19th century. So if we go back to the 1800s, we have figures like Franz Joseph Gall, who is the phrenologist, the proponent of cerebral organology, who argues for a very strict kind of cerebral localization, right? So you say, okay, the cerebral cortex has 27 mental organs, and each of those organs has one faculty it's associated with. Some of those are things we might recognize, like a memory for words, and some of them are things we might not, like a sense of metaphysics, things like that. The historian Stanley Finger has done a lot to kind of talk about Gall's system. And then we have at this time figures like Marie Jean-Pierre Flourens, who argues against Gall that the cortex is actually an undifferentiated mass of tissue that participates equally as a surface in all of the kinds of faculties that Gall is talking about. Gall was really looking at differences in people's talents, right? What could you be good at while being bad at other things, right? And pattern in kind of studying brain injury to some extent. In humans, what Flourens was doing was taking the cortex of animals like pigeon and actually sectioning or resecting it, right, and then seeing what would happen. And what Flourens claimed is you didn't have faculties like hearing or sight lost kind of one by one. You sort of had either global good functioning or global poor functioning as you went, right? Okay. So as we get further into the 19th century, we have localization score some striking victories, right? So the brain on the first slide was a very famous brain of a patient who's often called patient tan in the history, right? So Paul Broca, the neurosurgeon, found a patient who was able to understand speech, so he could understand what you were saying to him, but he could only say the word tan, right? And so he would repeat tan over and over again. A post-mortem analysis of Tan's brain, which you see there, reveals damage in the left inferior frontal gyrus, which we now call Broca's area and consider connected with speech production. So from here, a wave of localization findings ensue. One famous vignette that I didn't put on this slide is the 1881 Seventh International Medical Congress, right? So there you actually had public demonstrations by people like Friedrich Goltz, who was he was an anti-localizationist, though not as extreme as Florenz, and David Ferrier. And David Ferrier actually took a monkey and gave focal brain lesions that caused the monkey to have one-sided paralysis like a stroke patient, right? And Charcot at that 1881 Congress, yelled out from the crowd, c'est un malade, like it's a patient. So from there, localization became very popular. But as we're just doing vignettes, this is just to say that even when you go into the 20th century, there always are your opponents of localization, right? So in the 20th century, you have Carl Lashley. He was studying rodents running through mazes. He wanted to know where in the cortex the engram or the trace of the memory is. And he took on something much like a kind of very systematic scientific version of what Florenz was doing. So he systematically lesioned rodent cortex and then looked at how that correlated with maze performance. And based on his results, he said that really maze performance is not affected by where you lesion, but the overall mass that you've damaged, right? And so he then formulated these two principles: equipotentiality, cortex is functionally interchangeable, one part does the same thing as the other, and mass action, which is now sometimes called holism, which is that the cortex acts as one functional unit, right? Okay, so moving on into the 20th and 21st century, skipping over a lot of things, but in 1988, with the rise of PET, positron emission tomography neuroimaging, you had Peterson et al., who used PET to localize different speech operations to different cortical regions, right? So, generating words is associated here, and hearing words is up there, speaking words, and so forth, right? The rise of neuroimaging in the 1980s led to a real exuberance for localization and a catalog of triumphs, right? So in a 2010 review paper, the MIT neuroscientist Nancy Kanwisher, who famously discovered in 1997 the part of the cerebral cortex we call the fusiform face area, right? Region of the brain that's very active when we're looking at faces, whose damage leads to prosopagnosia, right? Argued that really the cortex is a mosaic of regions that are specialized for particular cognitive functions, right? And so here on the right, we see depicted, a parahippocampal place area, a lateral occipital complex involved in object recognition, a fusiform face area, and so forth, right? But there have always been, in this case, in the 20th century, 21st century, coming from network and connectionist approaches, detractors of this kind of strict localization, right? So McIntosh in 2000 argues that what a region does varies depending on its network context. Sporns in 2014 argues that we should really be thinking of networks as sort of the main unit rather than regions. You've always had your anti-localizationists. Okay. So in 2002, the philosopher Jennifer Mundale helpfully sought to say, okay, what are these debates about? They've been always going on. How do we define localization and anti-localization, right? And so she says that localization is the commitment to the idea that the brain, or with the cortex we could say here, has functionally distinct, physically discrete components, right? And the anti-localization is denying one of these things. So either we could have equipotentialism, the cortex is functionally equivalent, one part is the same as the other, functionally speaking, or holism, how to understand how the brain subserves any given function. It's necessary to understand the whole brain, or at least large interacting parts of it, as an integrated functional unit. Okay, so in 2002, in a beautiful paper, Mundale says, oh, these debates, they keep raging on, right? And then in 2022, it looks like they're still raging on, right? So we could have told a story, maybe I skipped one slide too far. We could have told a story about the triumph of localization, right? We could have said, look, there were anti-localizationists like Florenz and Lashley, but they're just wrong. Like the cortex is a mosaic of functionally specific regions and networks. And we could have pointed to a bunch of findings using fMRI to localize functions, or things like transcranial magnetic stimulation, which allow you to transiently deactivate a brain area that you're interested in and say, look, what this really tells us is that we have, parts of the brain that are specific to, visual object processing, or, visual attention, or, conflict resolution, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Okay. But this debate has recently been revived in a big way. And there are now books written by people who are philosopher/neuroscientists, or neuroscientists who are philosophically minded, or neuroscientists writing in the Imaging Neuroscience Journal, who are arguing that localization is failing as a scientific paradigm, that in some sense, the anti-localizationists were onto something. So this is the debate I sought out to analyze. Okay, so when I sought to analyze this debate, I noticed something, right? The anti-localizationists, people like Michael Anderson and people like Luis Pessoa, don't believe in equipotentialism or holism. So none of them say that the cortex is an undifferentiated mass. None of them say that the whole brain participates equally in all cognitive functions. So then I wanted to know, okay, well, what is it, right, that they're really saying? Right? Hence my need to provide the dimensions of localization. And just because I added a lot of animations, these people would say that anti-localization didn't die. It was just eclipsed, and it will come again. Right? Okay. So now on to the dimensions of localization. This picture will be clear in a moment. Okay. So one moment just to stop and pause before I get into this section. I want to say what I mean by structure and function, though we could actually talk about this a lot for reasons that'll hopefully become clear as we go along. By neural structure, I'm often going to talk about regions, right? These are kind of canonically areas of the cerebral cortex identified at a cellular level of cytoarchitectonics by Brodmann, or revisions to that. We have kind of revised maps of areas. So often I'll be talking about, kind of macro scale brain regions or networks of those regions. But really, we could be referring to any neural structure, right? We could be talking about individual, population of neurons in an area. We could be talking about columns within an area. We could be talking about the area. We could be talking about networks, right? It's not privileging any structure, my account. Also, what do I mean by function? Well, there's a lot to say there. Actually, I have a paper where I argue for function pluralism in neuroscience, and that maybe neuroscience productively has room for multiple notions of function, as Justin Garson has argued for in biology more generally. But here I mean causal role functions in the sense intended by Cummins in 1975, and Craver in 2001, who sees a connection between multi-level mechanistic explanations and Cummins functions. So the operative notion of function here is just that the function picks out the causal role that a structure plays in bringing about some, in this case, cognitive or behavioral capacity of a system that we're interested in analyzing, right? So for Cummins, we might say we want to understand the heart's function in the capacity of circulation and its beating, right? Because that's the causal role it plays, right? And so here, when I talk about a structure's function, I mean something like what is its causal or maybe computationally characterized contribution to some behavioral capacity like reaching, or cognitive capacity like working memory, or doing a working memory task that we're interested in, right? So that's what I mean here by function and structure. Okay, so this is the text-heavy slide. Very sorry. I argue, so what I do in this work that I've done, asking what is localization, is to look at alleged violations of localization or places where it's alleged to fail, and then kind of reverse engineer the concept of localization by analyzing its alleged failures, okay? So the output to me of this reverse engineering process is that functional localization, or commitment to localizationism, has three tenets. I call them structural specialization, localization of function, and intrinsicality, okay? Structural specialization says if I take a structure, it is specialized for a function. So think Broca's area, speech production, okay? Localization of function is different. That's saying start with a function and there's some structure that it will stably localize to. So take reaching behavior, there's a structure that will carry that out, right? Intrinsicality is the idea that the functions of neural structures can be understood independently or relatively independently of the context. So you can kind of say what it does without having to reference what the rest of the system is doing. Okay, so each of these sort of tenets, or as I'll maybe later call them dimensions, has a characteristic violation. So the violation of specialization is what Michael Anderson calls neural reuse. And also neuronal recycling by DeHaan would be another example. Localization of function has a violation called neural degeneracy. And intrinsicality has a violation that is context sensitivity. All right. So in this framework, I will then call anti-localizationism the denial of one of these tenets. I will call radical anti-localizationism kind of some denial of all of them. Okay. All right. So some of you may be familiar with Michael Anderson's famous work on neural reuse. But the idea here is that neural structures, and here we're thinking of cortical regions, are recruited for multiple behavioral or cognitive functions, right? And one good example is Broca's area. So Broca's area is supposed to be our classic well-behaved area that does speech production or controls speech production. But there's a bunch of research linking Broca's to other functions, right? Broca's area is involved, neuroimaging evidence suggests, when you are imitating the movements of hands on a screen, right? So the hand makes a thumbs up and you make a thumbs up, motor imitation, right? There are studies of Broca's area in those who understand music and who understand the so-called grammar of music. And so when people are sort of recognizing that a crescendo is happening, something like that. I don't know music very well, so pardon me if that's not part of music grammar. Whenever music grammar things are happening, then this part of the brain is active as well. So in the initial formulation of reuse by Michael Anderson, who then becomes more radical, the proposal is that Broca's area really only does one thing, like it's maybe a hierarchical syntactic processor, right? But that one mechanical working is good for multiple cognitive functions, like speech production or motor imitation, right? I'll say here that meta-analyses, right? So where you're not looking at just one region, and you can find lots of examples of this kind of thing. There's lots of regions you can find where there's multiple proposed functional hypotheses, and somebody then proposes that there's one common working that explains them all. But in 2010, Anderson did a meta-analysis where he basically looked at a bunch of different cortical areas, defined what he called domains, like vision, memory, mathematics, et cetera, and found that every area so defined was recruited for 6 or more domains, right? There are empirical challenges for this kind of hypothesis. If you had smaller areas, you might intuitively think you'd have less reuse. Anderson does have some comparison of kind of larger and smaller areas. Also, the granularity with which you describe functions would seem to matter for how this kind of meta-analysis succeeds. But I will say that neural reuse is maybe well thought of as a broader property of nervous systems. So if you go from humans to rodent models, or you go to invertebrates, you find brain structures that at some level of description are recruited for multiple functions, and that doesn't go away just by carving the area into smaller bits, right? I won't say too much about that. Here, this is the paper. Okay, so we have structural specialization. Maybe the cortex systematically violates that. Maybe no matter where we look in the cortex, we sort of get lots of different functions. So is it true that if we take one function, though, like performing a working memory task or visual attention, and that will localize to one part of the brain? And neural degeneracy says no. We often find that different structures are capable of supporting the same function. Neural degeneracy, or degeneracy, is a broader form of robustness in biological systems. It was characterized by Edelman and Galli, to my knowledge, in 2001. And it's often portrayed like this, that you have 2 different mechanisms that are capable of producing the same systemic output or capable of performing the same function. Neural degeneracy has been linked to multiple realization in philosophy. Philosophers such as Carrie Figdor and Trey Boone have argued that degeneracy may actually be the way, neural degeneracy might be the right way to sort of understand what multiple realization in real, human neural systems is like. One example of degeneracy is Seguier et al.'s work on networks for single word reading. Okay. So what Seguier et al. Did is they basically flashed words on a screen rapidly and looked at what kinds of brain structures engaged with MRI were involved in reading those words. What they initially found is a patient population that had damage to one area that was considered kind of critical for reading single words presented rapidly. And it was the left ventral occipitotemporal border, the LVOT. So people with damage to the LVOT had trouble reading rapidly presented words initially. Then they got better at it later. Okay, so you have this kind of what looks like neuroplasticity, but where a structure changes its function in response to damage, or a new structure takes on that function. But what they did actually is they characterized then the pathway by which people were reading these rapidly presented words while lacking the LVOT, and found that there's this other pathway that goes from here to here that seems to support reading rapidly presented words in them. And then they went back to healthy participants and asked, okay, do healthy participants reading rapidly presented words have both of these networks? And what they found is yes. So they basically found that, essentially in healthy individuals, to a different extent, when reading rapidly presented words, either one network or the other was supporting that, right? And it was a little bit like handedness, like people's brains sort of had a preference to read words with one or the other that you could characterize. So if that kind of story is right, then the function of reading a rapidly presented word can be subserved by two different brain structures. Now, I will say there are empirical difficulties, of course, for assessing neural degeneracy, right? So there are many who claim that neural degeneracy is a really widespread property of nervous systems and of humans. And one kind of group associated with Lisa Feldman Barrett's lab and emotion studies thinks that degeneracy happens a lot, and that different instances of experiencing, say, anger or fear are actually brought about by different underlying brain networks. Now, one thing I'll say is, just based on neuroimaging, if you see that, the kind of patterns of areas engaged are different in different instances of what we might call anger, you don't really know if there's a causal connection. Right. So part of the reason I have been so interested in the work of Kathy Price is they're really establishing, through combining neuropsychology and fMRI, a causal role for different structures, different brain areas. I will say here another challenge is how common is this, right? So it's kind of hard to demonstrate, that this happens. Is it really frequent, or is it just something that happens, with very overlearned skills like reading? Right. So these are good questions that you might have. Okay. So we've seen maybe systematic violations of structural specialization, systematic violations of the localization of function, by functions that localize kind of disjointly to different networks. And now we'll also talk about violations of so-called intrinsicality, right? So some in philosophy and neuroscience have proposed that neural structures, for example, brain regions or networks, have contextually varying functions. And one of these is the philosopher Dan Bernstein, who's really argued for context mattering in functional localization and the context sensitivity of neural functions. And his original example, which I've never seen precisely rebutted in the literature, though some disagree, is related to the middle temporal area, or MT. So what Dan Bernstein says in some papers is that you have populations of neurons in MT. This is often considered an area that supports motion direction discrimination, like dots that are either moving this way or that. But there's also a role for MT in depth perception, right? So what Bernstein argues is that it really seems like this neural population is involved in depth perception and motion detection, but there's no, according to him, common, in Anderson's word, working or computation that explains MT's role. You sort of have computational models of motion perception that specify a role for MT, and you have computational models of depth perception that specify a role for MT, and they don't look like you're talking about MT doing the same thing. And Bernstein also argues that you can't make this go away by just carving up MT, that on some level it's the same population. Another example that I really find fun and animating is Maribet et al.'s study using TMS on visual cortex regarding Braille reading. So what Maribet and colleagues did is they had some people in the lab wear a blindfold for 5 days and some people not do that, okay? So then they had everybody read Braille while they put TMS over their visual cortex. And what they found was that TMS, which is a transient lesion or a deactivation, and in this case, you can kind of tune it different ways, but in this case, they found that TMS applied to visual areas affected the ability of the people wearing the blindfolds to read Braille, but not the people who were not wearing the blindfolds, right? And so here it looks like, whether or not you're wearing a blindfold is now affecting whether this region is supporting this kind of text. And here I'll say that one empirical difficulty related to context sensitivity is that people talk about a lot of different kinds of contexts, right? So context could mean the neural context. In McIntosh's original formulation, this is what the region is doing when it's with these network partners versus when it's with these network partners. We could be talking about neuromodulatory context. So you can have a neural circuit that is either bathed in neurotransmitter or not. Or we could be talking about some other kind of environmentally defined context, like in this case, whether you're wearing the blindfold or not. Right? So this is saying there's lots of different contexts, task-related versus, say, network-related. Okay, so we started with, well, what are we doing on the slide? Very helpfully, some neuroscientists in 2024 said that my framework could be helpful to neuroscientists for thinking about functional localization, and they drew this cool picture of the 3 dimensions that I was positing. So, right, it's a total shameless self-promotion, but also it gives me a visual image that I can, refer to make my view more comprehensible, right? Note for the, folks, if you want to talk to scientists, they really see in pictures, I think, many of the times. Okay, so here we can kind of think about localization as having, these 3 kind of dimensions, like, structural specialization and, contextual variation, or intrinsicality versus context sensitivity, or, localization of function versus degeneracy, right? And we can then sort of locate where different views fall on this kind of spectrum, and it sort of tells us what we ought to be assessing, right? Are structures specialized? Do functions localize, et cetera? Okay, so one thing that jumped out at me using this framework is we can use it to really distinguish what are just small tweaks or changes in the localization framework to what kinds of functional architectures people are proposing that are really problematic, right? So I'll depict this better a little bit later, but I actually think of like Anderson 2010's neural reuse, for example, as a relatively minor modification, to localization. It says that at some level of description, structures are recruited for a lot of functions, but functions still localize stably, and we can specify the functions independently of context, right? So you get a kind of small change. So Anderson, having decided in 4 years that we need to go much farther, right? So we'll see some more radical anti-localizationist frameworks now. And I'll give you 2 of them, and they're very complicated. I'll give you just kind of the flavor. There's a book-length treatment in both. In Anderson's, it's this wonderful book, After Phrenology, Neural Reuse in the Interactive Brain, right? Okay. So in After Phrenology, Anderson presents a view, which is sometimes called talons, which says that brain regions, at the level we've been talking about them, perform a broad range of overlapping functions, that really every region is capable in some sense of performing all of the functions in the most kind of extreme way it's presented in the book. And that what brain regions really differ in is not whether they're specialized for one function or another, but just their disposition to be involved in some versus another. It likens it to personality. Brain areas have different personalities or different dispositions along the same dimensions, right? He then argues that cognitive functions, like working memory, are realized by transiently or temporarily assembled local neural subsystems or talents. So they're varying structural coalitions in different instantiations of the same cognitive function, and brain regions are dispositionally recruited. It's hard to kind of wrap your head around the dispositional recruitment. I think a good analogy is like a football team, right? Everybody can run, everybody can throw the ball, and everybody can block, but some people can do this stuff better than others, and some people do this stuff more than others. So the quarterback usually throws, the tight end could throw on some trick play, but they usually don't. The running back typically runs, they're better at running than the quarterback, et cetera. Might be a way to kind of visualize what's going on. Okay, and then moving ahead, we have Pessoa's The Entangled Brain. In the entangled brain, how perception, cognition, and emotion are woven together. Pessoa also argues for a very complexity-focused anti-localizationist picture. What Pessoa argues in this book is that the brain has 3 features: massive combinatorial connectivity. Everything is kind of connected reciprocally to everything else. Highly distributed functional coordination. This is more along a dimension of control, which I haven't really talked about, but the control of what structures are doing is not kind of under like hierarchical or centralized, but is rather distributed. And finally, that networks or circuits are the fundamental units, right? And Pessoa thinks that these three things, and thinking about them carefully, shows us that brain networks exhibit what he calls interactional complexity. The basic idea here is the basic functional units are networks. Networks are sets of areas that are communicating with a bunch of other networks, and they're all massively interconnected. And therefore, you get temporally varying network functions that are not reducible to the functions of their constituent parts. And the way Pessoa puts this in some parts of the book are that the brain does have type 1, he calls them type 1 networks, or networks where you have constituents with subfunctions within them, but you also have type 2 networks, which are networks where functions are kind of emerging. Right? His central, this is a depiction of, brain networks, varying over time, and his hypothesis that in some cases we have, networks that have coherent subfunctions, but in other cases we have functions in blue that arise from where two networks are interacting with each other. And for those interested in his framework, he, in a chapter, gives an extended treatment of fear extinction in the circuits responsible for that behavior. And he argues that fear extinction is a type 2 network exhibiting interactional complexity. All right. So we're not going to delve too deeply into these frameworks, but here I want to show the triumph of conceptual analysis on a slide, right? And this is really where all my budget went, right? Okay, so we can now look at localization not as a spectrum or a dichotomy between localization and anti-localization, but we can think of the brain's functional architecture as falling in this three-dimensional space with variation along different axes, right? So we can say, well, Canwisher was really kind of at the center of this space, right? If you take a function, it has a stable structure it localizes to. If you take a structure, it's specialized to a function, and we can understand what regions or networks are doing independently of the activity of other regions or networks, right? Then we have our kind of small deviations, right? Our kind of immoderate sorts of views. So Anderson, 2010, insists on neural reuse. Structures are recycled or reused for, I should have said reused, not recycled, it's a different view, reused for different functions. And yet functions do stably localize, and yet we can describe those functions relatively independently. And then finally, we have the wilder views, which I think are more anti-localizationist, right? And don't worry too much about the precise, I don't know how to even precisely put these on the axis, but we have something like, Anderson's after phrenology is now something rather like this, right? Where, functions can be realized by lots of different networks or regions, where regions are massively, recycled between functions, and where what function is, going on is involves referencing then what other coalitions they're assembled with. And I think he really emphasizes the degeneracy aspect, whereas Pessoa, I think, really emphasizes the contextually varying nature of the functions. Okay. So a couple things about this conceptual analysis. I do think that when you're my analysis tells you nothing about when localization has bent and when it's broken, right? So we can talk about that later. But I do think in some sense, right, we have kind of your standard, paradigm, you're kind of shifting of the paradigm. Maybe here and here you have the breaking of the paradigm. Maybe functional localization is in some sense false if late Anderson and Pessoa are correct. Okay. One thing I think my framework also does is tell you what localization debates are not about, right? And one thing they're not about is regions versus networks. I think this is a complete red herring, but you find it everywhere, right? So, imagine a view of the brain where you just have networks and those are your basic units. That could still be compatible with all, I think, the major tenets of localization, right? So suppose that, you have a network for working memory and that's all it does. You have a network for speech production, that's all it does, right? I don't think such a shift does any injury to the localizationist framework. It just says that the units of localization are bigger parts of the brain, right? So I think that's maybe one of the biggest things. But the other thing it tells us is that we can move independently along this dimension. So a lot of people think like, okay, if brain areas don't specialize well, then that just has to mean we're in this kind of regime of contextually shifting functions, or that functions don't localize. And I don't think that's true. Okay. All right. So a triumph for philosophy. Well, not really. I mean, all I've done is sort of put views in boxes, right? And I don't want to just put views in boxes, although that's a great thing to do. I want to get to the truth of the matter. But with 24 minutes left on my clock, we'll see how far along we can get to the truth of the matter, which is not very. Okay. So I want to give sort of a Kuhnian framing of what's going on for a second, right? So we have this idea in books like After Phrenology and the Entangled Brain that localization is in crisis, right? And so here we get echoes of Kuhn, and thanks, Mark, right? So it is particularly in periods of acknowledged crisis that scientists have turned to philosophical analysis. Scientists have not generally needed or wanted to be philosophers, right? And so I was looking at some of the papers where people talk about this need to revisit our assumptions about brain localization, and the ones that talk about philosophy say things like a crisis and a turning point, right? So we can maybe think of what's going on is something like a paradigm that's under some kind of tension or crisis, right? So we have this idea that functions will localize to brain areas, that we can produce brain maps with kind of tight structure-function relationships, and then with things like neural degeneracy, with neural reuse, with context sensitivity, we're getting kind of a pileup of anomalies, right? That then affect whether we should reject this paradigm or not. And Pessoa and Anderson say, pretty explicitly in their books, that localization is a framework that has had successes, but it's not going to get us where we need to go. Okay, so one way we could think about what's going on is, as you get, kind of violations of localization along these dimensions, are you having a paradigm that's kind of bending or a paradigm that's just sort of breaking? I do want to have a note of caution here, just so I don't sound like I'm saying things that are more outlandish than I mean to be saying. Everybody in this debate acknowledges the successes of localization to a degree, right? So all of them say things like, we know where to put deep brain stimulation probes with increasing accuracy. We know that, the fusiform face area, so-called, has something to do with, visual expertise or face recognition. We know, what would likely happen if you TMS Broca's while somebody is, speaking. But as they point out, there are many structures for which we don't have good functional definitions. And actually, cognitive neuroscience is not doing very well at discovering biomarkers for psychiatric illness. And so what a lot of the anti-localizationists say is not so much that localization has entirely failed. There's sort of a range from it was a flawed paradigm to begin with, and we should, all the way to sort of like, well, it has successes, but we've run out of those. The successes were low-hanging fruit. We need to embrace complexity to get the fruit that's higher up on the tree. Right. Okay. So maybe I'll just put a couple of my cards on the table. I don't know where we'll end up in this space. I can't solve neuroscience for you. My sympathies, for what it's worth, are actually with those who think the paradigm is bending rather than those who think it's breaking. But that's not really what I'm up to here. Okay, what I'm up to here is, can we, with the science here now, kind of get answers to these sorts of questions? Like, can we just decide based on either the published science or the soon-to-be published science, kind of where we should be in this space? And I think there are huge barriers to that. So I actually want to talk about some of the reasons for pessimism, that we can just decide on where we are in the space. And here I'll move kind of from the empirical or conceptual issues into issues related to the social organization of science, right? So there are huge empirical challenges, and one of them is scale dependence, right? So I think, my discussion of Anderson's meta-analysis probably primed you to think that whether we find features like the specialization of a structure for a function will really depend on the scale of structures to which we're attending. Are we looking at regions, subregions, networks, populations, et cetera? And we can see this in the distinction between univariate versus multivariate methods in fMRI, where no region is specialized for emotions, but maybe if you look at multivariate patterns over the whole brain, you gain specificity, right? So in that case, moving up a level might get you more specificity. It's also possible in some cases we need to move down a level, like a region appears not to be specialized, but we find a specialized subregion. I'll talk about such an example later. And this really became very salient to me during the population doctrine workshop that Wayne organized, where you have people who are looking at single unit recordings of brain areas versus what happens when you start looking at interacting populations. And so, maybe whether we get things like specialization or even things like degeneracy really depends on the scale at which you look at it, right? And I also think scope is a very vexing issue that I don't even know how to solve. It's like, so if you decide that neural degeneracy is a sort of a real phenomenon, how do you know how common it is? Like, should it really worry you that some networks are degenerate? Is it widespread or not? There's no real, systematic ways of deciding that currently. And here I'll just say very briefly, looking at time, that there are also just places where the people looking at it really seem to disagree in philosophy and in neuroscience. And one of them is about context sensitivity of the kind talked about by Bernstein. So remember that people like Bernstein think that shifts in your network or neuromodulatory context can actually alter the computational properties, say, of a brain region or of a population of neurons within that area, or can give rise to emergent functions. There are neuroscientists who just deny that this is the case. What they say is that we all know that a region can be recruited, sometimes with these members to subserve some task, and sometimes it can be recruited with other members to subserve some other task. We all know that those kinds of things are going on. But we don't know is whether the region or the population so defined can morph its computational properties, right? So in a criticism of this kind of idea, Krakauer says, nobody's really demonstrated to me, the neuroscientist Krakauer has said, nobody's really demonstrated that brain regions have these chameleonic properties, right? The view there would be that the causal contribution is really tied to, say, the synaptic weights in the circuit, and you can't just alter that by inputs. Right? And Barrick has recently argued that the contextualism and variantism framing is a false dichotomy to begin with. That actually neurons or neural populations can have functions that are always the same, but they're sensitive to contextual changes. So maybe we're dealing with a false dichotomy. Okay. So I was thinking, well, there's intractable kind of barriers to getting at some of these questions. We disagree about whether neurons or populations or areas can change their computational properties and contexts. But then I thought, oh, well, maybe I should just, maybe Kuhn tells me to be worried, but Bechtel and Richardson tell me to relax, right? So Bechtel and Richardson in 1993 and then later in 2010 argue that decomposition and localization of function are really heuristics, right? So we take the behavior of a system and we decompose it, right? We take, the physical structure, we decompose it. We try to map the behavior onto the structure. And what we do is we see if this works. And then if not, we kind of adjust in ways we can, like, okay, we'll divide up the structures more, divide up the tasks more. And then if it stops working, we'll kind of exit the mechanist program, right? So we'll just kind of see, is it working or not? And that'll tell us, whether to stay or go. With this, they do say that heuristics are strategies that can be applied, and that we don't have to be a priori committed to decomposition, localization. And they also say, of course, though, that the strategies tend to succeed in systems that are modular or near decomposable, and they tend to, or that have interacting parts that are linear, and they tends to fail in systems that start to defy these properties. But we don't know in advance. We just apply the strategies, and we keep doing it over again. We get to the truth. So according to this view, maybe it's time for me to just get my lawn chair and my beer and say, okay, well, I sort of, I said what the problem is, but the science will kind of fix it, and I can just sit here and all the work is to be done. But I don't think so, right? I set out to see what scientists are thinking about these ongoing questions, and what I found made me more pessimistic, not along the lines of the empirical challenges, but whether the science is socially organized in ways that are conducive to answering these questions. So I call this the search for a fair playing field, right? Okay, so if we wanted to just, kind of talk loosely about a Bechtel and Richardson heuristic, we kind of see if, these functions localize. If that stops working, we kind of abandon, the program. I could say, well, why isn't this either working quickly or why isn't it working well such that we agree on these questions? Because we seem to disagree about really basic things. And here, some of the barriers are conceptual. I can find places where neuroscientists are asking, what is a context or what is a network? Some of them are empirical. So if we think that there are interactions, causal interactions between things that happen, let's say a mesoscale, brain organization and macro scale, how do we bridge and define those causal interactions? But there are also issues that I would put in the heading of social organization, right? So how do the ways that we work together, talk together, pick methods, how does that stuff influence our approach to this question? And one thing I saw that was so interesting I had to share was this recent nomenclature committee on networks, right? Just to give you a sense of the kind of social organization problems that I'm talking about. So all kinds of folks like Sporns and, et cetera, want to say that we, in Pessoa, don't talk about regions, talk about networks, right? Talk about networks that change over time, talk about networks that interact with each other. And one question came up is, what do we even mean by networks and how do we define them, right? And so Uden, who's done a ton of work on the so-called salience network involving the insula and other structures, led a committee to say, well, what are the networks we're talking about, and are we all talking about the same thing? The philosopher Philippe de Brigard was on this paper. I highly recommend reading it if you're interested in, kind of consensus and science kind of stuff. So basically, there was some agreement, like, okay, the default mode network, that's a thing. But there was also a ton of disagreement, including about Udin's favorite, the salience network. And there was furthermore disagreement about whether we should give brain networks purely anatomical designations or whether we should give them functional designations, right? Furthermore, there was disagreement about just, whether we should even incorporate dynamics when trying to define networks. So some people kind of thought, well, you can identify networks statically, but now if you're talking about networks changing over time, you're not actually talking about the same network, so you shouldn't use the same word that you used to allude to the static network, and so forth. Okay, so my entry into this, I'm really interested in the question, what is the social organization of science about functional localization? I would love to do surveys of scientists and what they think about localization. One might worry, like maybe Anderson and Pessoa are just very unusual neuroscientists, and the anti-localizationists are actually a small part of the group, and most people think localization is doing fine. I'd love to know the answer to these questions, but the best thing I could do at the moment was look at some special issues where a bunch of neuroscientists discuss this, right, and get into it. So in the Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience in 2023, Pessoa's Entangled Brain was a target article, and a bunch of neuroscientists and philosophers talked about what they think of the book project, right? And here, what really jumped out to me, I was expecting, some progress on questions about, neural contexts or, progress about, computational shifting and things like that. But what really jumped out to me is that people didn't think there was a stable playing field or a fair playing field for assessing these questions, which is to say there were lots of accusations of bias. Not nefarious ideological bias, but bias in the kinds of methodologies we're using and the kinds of questions we're asking, right? And so just to give a few, this person says, omitting the function of these central components, if you kind of adopt anti-localizationist approaches, runs the risk of biasing findings throughout the broader neuroimaging literature. That aerial brain maps that we look at ground our thoughts about brain function and short circuit our imaginations. That we see borders drawn on the cortical surface and assume they're the most important organizing principle. That we ask our data to tell a story where those areas that we've defined are the main characters. On the anti-localizationist side, that we need new ways of analyzing neuroimaging data that allow us to look at dynamic shifts in networks, but then saying, developing these new conceptual frameworks will require the community to foster, embrace, and develop a diversity of ideas and new approaches. Some will be more foreign, and we can't let our lack of familiarity bias us from using them, right? So just over and over, people were talking about, we can't see this phenomenon, I want to, there's a bias, etc. So this really jumped out at me, which got me to somewhere I didn't really expect to go at the beginning of the project, which was looking at the philosophy of science literature on bias and trying to ask, well, what forms of bias might we see in this literature? And also, are these neuroscientists right to accuse each other of bias? And so this is where I want to end in the last 10 minutes. So there's an interesting question about how to define bias in science, but some philosophers, like Fernandez Pinto, have said that bias is some kind of epistemic deficit that introduces, say, systematic error into the scientific process. Here, I just wanted to note that we're not really talking about nefarious ideological biases, like you're throwing the test tubes for the sample you don't like out, but we're mostly talking about just psychological properties or methodological decisions that are kind of harming your ability to get to the ground truth in some kind of iterative cycle of scientific investigation. And here in the literature, we can identify a few different broad types of bias. So some are value-based, right? This is discussed often in the literature and feminist philosophy of science, like Harding, where your values are influencing the decisions you make and what you see. But they're also just cognitive biases. So scientists are people, and people are prone to cognitive biases the preference for familiar things, or confirmation bias, where you're more likely to believe something if it confirms your view. And then we have another category, which is methodological bias, where the method that you employ has kind of cooked into it assumptions, right? And sometimes people talk about publication bias as being a form of methodological bias. So just to give an example of a kind of bias that's a specific bias, right? That's kind of the idea of bias. These are categories, and this is a specific one. Preference bias is the infringement of an implicit or explicit standard to achieve a preferred result. All right. So I'll have time to just go over a couple of these accusations of bias. We might ask kind of where they might fit into this framework. Right? So one thing we see in this area is the accusation of methodological bias in experimental design. So Westlin et al. Worried that neuroimagers were rightly, at the beginning of their study, worried about the multiple comparison problem. If we look at the whole brain, we're doing so many t-tests that we're going to get lots of false positives, so we'll have a strict statistical threshold. But their claim is that the field then converged on a set of statistical thresholds and methods that favor finding distributed islands of activity rather than distributed whole brain kind of signals. So their claim is that we could now get better statistical power with whole brain studies, but we're just not used to doing that. And so over and over again, you kind of find islands because your statistical methodology is designed to find islands. And so they say these findings show that modeling decisions rooted in an ontological commitment to localization can create self-fulfilling prophecies. Right? And this is the image here of your, maybe the signal is actually in the whole brain, but your statistical method gives you localized islands. All right, so this is kind of analogous to saying that the field as a whole is sort of looking, for the keys under the light, right? One thing I found interesting is the literature in philosophy of science on bias often says that bias is a violation of a norm toward a preferred conclusion. And this is different. It's saying sort of like as a community, we've embraced the wrong sort of norm. There's not necessarily a norm violation here. And one question that came up as I was reading this that I don't have a good answer to is actually to what extent are there really established norms, right? So in neuroimaging, so Dina Roski's argued that brain imaging has a lot of what she calls inferential distance, right? That as a form of measuring what's going on in the world, you're really making a lot of statistical inferences and a lot of data processing decisions in order to arrive at your final conclusions. So we might even ask here, are there norms, true norms for addressing these kind of questions, or do we really have different labs with kind of bespoke data analysis pipelines? Right? Hayden, one of the other authors I was looking at, talked about the worry that brain maps are creating publication bias in favor of localization. And so the idea here is that we all learn neuroscience by looking at, depictions of the brain with functions superimposed on it. As I mentioned, Hayden says that, we see the borders drawn on the cortical surface and we assume they're the important thing. We ask our data to tell a story where they're the players. But he goes on to mention a part of the literature that he's upset with, which is a specific association between the anterior cingulate cortex and conflict monitoring. So he says, in my experience, the anterior cingulate cortex was associated early on with the detection of conflict, right? Two different kind of conflicting signals. And what he says is that in his view, it's hard to get published when you're researching this brain structure if your story doesn't somehow tie it back to conflict. And from the standpoint of 2023, he says, I don't even think that the anterior cingulate cortex even is a key player in conflict, but I think you can't really get published unless you address that kind of story. So here the claim would be that publication bias fits with your aerial maps that you were looking at, or your functional hypotheses that are floating around in the literature. The last thing I wanted to say here is that these biases kind of cut both ways. However, they don't always favor the localizationist. They may favor the anti-localizationist. And here I just wanted to highlight kind of a global feature, which is that if you're really interested in assessing some of the questions I am, which are not, does one area have multiple functions, but sort of how do we think about areas, in general, you might need to do meta-analyses of the kind that Anderson did in 2010 or more sophisticated meta-analyses. I think in theory, if the kind of bias that Hayden's pointing to is sort of real, it's like, well, you can't get published when you mention the anterior cingulate cortex unless you also mention conflict moderating, right? Meta-analyses are really, linking, regional, coordinates and, brain activations to text mining for, hypothesized tasks and functional relationships. So if that publication bias was the case, then you could say, well, maybe, areas, could look, like they have less localization, just because like we're also always having to talk about the big area, something like that. All right. So the question here, again, very provocative, very work in progress, is it possible that brain maps as like scientific artifacts or, pedagogical tools kind of create some kind of reification bias in neuroscience? All right. So I want to end there with a couple statements and thoughts. So thanks for your attention here. I'll say that localization and anti-localization in neuroscience, it's a live debate. It's not a dichotomy. Functional localization has three tenets: specialization, localization of function, and intrinsicality. And there's an open empirical question about the extent to which these tenets are held or violated. And I think that assessing these frameworks will require grappling with really thorny empirical and conceptual problems, as well as questions about the social organization of science. And maybe here I'll just nod to the philosopher of neuroscience, Jackie Sullivan's work. She's argued that pluralism, where different scientists pursue different investigative strategies, can be in some cases productive. But in other cases where they're just merely talking past each other or strawmanning each other or other kinds of things, that you can have kind of self-defeating or unproductive pluralism. And so I'm hoping to analyze the kinds of accusations of methodological bias in this literature and kind of say, well, look, are we really looking at a place where different people can productively employ different methods? Or are we looking at a place where your theoretical kind of biases are informing your methodology selection, and therefore what we'll kind of see when we're doing this research is sort of what we wanted to see or what we expected to see. And I think this kind of links up with the big theme in Chiramuto's The Brain Abstracted, which her story writ large is that in neuroscience we're often not studying the brain in reality, but we're studying kind of our conception that we've constructed. I'm not as anti-realist as her, but I think it's a kind of provocative note to end on. So thank you so much for your time and attention.
Take a 2-minute break and you have to take a
Thank you, Wayne.